putting geological formations there introduces another theological problem, because the layers of geology have a record of death and suffering and dying. You have fossils there. So this viewpoint would put, the problem we have is Romans 5:12. You have sin before the fall of man, or at least Romans 5:12 attributes the sin and dying to Adam's sin, not Satan's sin. So, and it doesn't solve the science anyway. So I would not hold to this theory, and I would encourage you to abandon it even if you were raised with it. And this viewpoint would put day 1 beginning in verse 3. Grammatically, after verse 1, you have a long gap, and now you have 2 sequential clauses. So in the Hebrew, it's a little bit different in understanding of the Hebrew. The other viewpoint, you had verse 1 as an independent clause. And this translation will reflect that. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, comma, again. Now the other viewpoint, remember, verse 2 was related to verse 1, but verse 1 was the independent clause. And verse 2, and then, so you have a sequence with those same 3 circumstantial clauses. And then the earth, and here's a little change as well, the earth became waste and void. Then the other 2 other parts of verse 2. See the drastic difference there? And this is very important. In fact, this is the major problem here, as well as the interpretation of the vav there. The earth became, it views it as a pluperfect, basically, by one of the scholars in the Hebrew, which the Hebrew word there is most unlikely a pluperfect. That'd be the least likely way to start a narrative such as this. It's static. In other words, it's the word to be in the Hebrew. So it's not a past tense. But in order to have that gap, then you have to, in other words, God created originally, and then the earth became waste and void after this gap is inserted in there. See that? And now we have, then God said in verse 3. The support for it, there's the Hebrew word hayah in verse 2, pluperfect, and the earth became, that's how it's translated, at least the verb part is became. And the support is Jeremiah 4:23 and Isaiah 34, the only 2 places where we have tohu vabohu, which is the little phrase waste and void. And under those 2 verses, they are in a negative context, so they use those 2 verses as support for it. Now the argument against that is that in these 2 passages, it seems that God is undoing, and they're in passages with a context of judgment, where God is reversing the creative work. So it only superficially supports this viewpoint. It does help by explaining Satan's career, which the Bible doesn't explain, because all of a sudden in chapter 3, we have the serpent, and we know from the New Testament that it's ultimately linked to Satan. And the support they suggest is that it allows geological ages, but as I said, this just introduces more problems than it solves. In fact, it's not a good solution. And there are far more objections. Grammatically, it's probably not a pluperfect, that verb there in verse 2, and there's some other grammatical problems with it. Jeremiah 4:23 is probably a reference to a future undoing of the creation and has nothing to do with Genesis 1, verse 2. The Septuagint, or the Greek translation of Jeremiah 4:23 as uthen, nothing, which doesn't support. In fact, it argues against the link. And again, Isaiah 34:11 is a destruction of Edom rather than a creation. And it assumes ages of death and suffering before Adam's sin, which is one of the bigger objections. So we have the original creation, an absolute beginning, restitution theory, where you have an absolute beginning followed by a recreation. So most of Genesis 1 is a recreation of the heavens and the earth. And there's a third view, a pre-creation chaos view. It also has, like the second one, a relative beginning. Let me give you the features of it. This slide is on your outline. So verse 1 is an independent clause, and it is viewed as a summary statement. It's not part of the chronology. It's a summary statement. Verse 2 are these three circumstantial clauses, but instead of being related to verse 1, they're related actually forward to verse 3. So they're circumstantial with verse 3, so telling us something about verse 3, not something about verse 1. The first viewpoint said that these clauses related to verse 1. The second viewpoint saw these as somewhat independent from one and sequentially. In other words, God created the heavens and earth, gap of time. Now the earth was without form and void, etc. This viewpoint doesn't see a gap in that way. So it's related to verse 3 as the main clause rather than verse 1. And then verses 2 through 21 is the creation narrative. Schematically or on a timeline. So without respect to the chronology here, we have an introductory statement, introductory summary, creation statement, verse 1. In other words, this is how God in general created the heavens and the earth. And there's some support for that I'll show you in a moment. So verse 2 tells us that, detached from that, this formless and void condition, etc., is related to the conditions as God began to recreate in 6 days. So the recreation, verses 2 through 21. Now, I'm not mentioning chapter 2, the Sabbath rest. I'm just talking about the creative aspect, the 6 days. And Genesis, from this viewpoint, says that the original creation is not presented. Now, there's variations of this viewpoint. And one of the variations that I would hold to, but strictly speaking, this is the viewpoint. I would say that included in the summary statement is this original creation. And I present this last because I think this is probably the best view. The problem that I have with it is not seeing an original creation in Genesis 1. But I think it can be included in the summary statement. Okay? So day 1 would begin in verse 2 and run through verse 5. Does that make sense? The support for this view, well, first of all, grammatically, verse 1 is independent. Verse 2 is disjunctive. In other words, it's not related to verse 1 and would begin with a now. Gives us these 3 clauses, and they're connected with verse 3 rather than verse 1. So it would go, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, period. Summary statement. Does that make sense? Kind of a summary of the whole chapter. And perhaps more. Verse 2, while the earth, in other words, this is dependent on something else, not one, but dependent on verse 3. While the earth was formless and void, and etc., etc., then, uncapitalized, then God said. So the independent clause is in verse 3, and verse 2 is dependent. Does that make sense? See the differences? I think if you compare them on the back of the sheet, you'll see the differences. The support for this viewpoint, it's the only view, and this is why I think it's the best view, it's the only view that satisfies all the grammar. It satisfies all of the grammar. The vav at the beginning of verse 2 is totally different in form and function than the one that you find in verse 3. It has the same and, if you would translate it just literally. A vav in Hebrew is like and in English. And they're totally different. The other viewpoints make them, don't distinguish them. They see them as almost identical. This viewpoint sees a sharp distinction between them, and they are different in form and function. One of the strongest supports, also besides, well, this is strong enough, but another strong support is you have a parallel structure in the book of Genesis itself. In here it is. In chapter 2, if you study the Hebrew, you see it more so. But chapter 2, verse 4, you have another summary statement, much like you would have in chapter 1, verse 1. Chapter 2, verses 5 through 6, you have a series of circumstantial clauses, just like you have in verse 2. In chapter 2, verse 7, you have the main clause, just like you do in verse 3. The Hebrew structure is very similar, and the vavs are very similar as well. So you have that parallel structure. And you also have the similar construction in Genesis chapter 1. You have a parallel structure with Genesis 3:1, where in, 2:4 introduces ultimately chapter 3, but 3:1a, you have circumstantial clauses, like you would in verse 2, and then verse 1b, you have the main clause. So in Hebrew, you have a strikingly similar parallel there. And not only that, but you find, there's another reason. The haya in verse 2, or in a static sense, rather than became waste and void, the earth was. State of being, static. That is far more likely grammatically. It's also typical Semitic thought. And what we have in Genesis 1 itself, all of Genesis 1 is almost like an introductory summary of God's creation in 6 days. And then what do you have in chapter 2 after verse 4? You have some details of the most important part of God's creation. You have a second, what some might describe as a second creation account. It's not a second one different from the first. It's one that gives us the details of the most important part of creation. It's an expansion of the 6th day relating to man himself. And that's the way the Hebrews presented a lot of things in other literature as well, elsewhere. So it's typical Semitic thought to give a summary statement, verse 1, and then followed by some of the details. With that interpretation, this kind of drives the outline for chapter 1, and just to give you a quick overview or preview. So I'd see verse 1 as an introductory summary creation statement, either a pre-creation situation in verse 2 in terms of what follows,